Hello, everybody. I'm Canon John Denaro, the rector of St. Anne and the Holy Trinity Episcopal Church and Pro-Cathedral, the Pro-Cathedral of the Episcopal Diocese of Long Island in Brooklyn Heights. And I want to welcome you to this timely and important conversation, a webinar that we are calling Reimagining Policing in a Just World. I know many of you who have registered for the event. Some of you are colleagues, some good friends. Others of you who I don't know, I welcome with a heart full of enthusiasm and gratitude. All of you from different faith traditions and different backgrounds have come because of how important it clearly is for you and for all of us to be taking on this topic. It's especially thrilling to welcome Dr. Catherine Meeks and Andrea J. Ritchie, our guest presenters tonight, who will be in conversation with one another. Dr. Meeks is the executive director of the Absalom Jones Episcopal Center for Racial Healing in Atlanta. And there she is. And Andrea Ritchie is an attorney, an organizer, an author, most recently of Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color. Both of these women will tell you more about themselves before they engage in conversation with one another. I want to say a couple of other things by way of introduction. Oh, I should also mention that my colleague Marie Tatro, Mother Marie Tatro, is here, and I'm going to say more about her in a minute. Now that you know everyone who we all are on screen, let me just say a few things. I'll state first that the concerns about policing that most of us bring to this gathering are not new. We know this, but that they've taken on a new urgency in the last few months. And that while many of us worry about and pray about the need for change, and some of us have gotten out on the streets to demand it. I'm guessing that the women who are our guests for this webinar occasionally lose sleep over the state of policing in our country. And I'm certain that these days especially, they spend most of their waking hours thinking, writing, speaking, and engaging others about the ways police policies and practices have failed us, primarily because they've not resulted in the safety of all of us equally. There's our two voices among many who have something thoughtful to say about reimagining policing. They've had the chance to learn about each other's work, but this is the first time they're meeting and speaking with one another. I believe it's fair to say that they'll be addressing the topic from different sides of the same side of the ongoing debate about policing in our cities. They also recognize the broad theme of this conversation can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. I'll leave it to them to take on the theme, and I'm confident that we will all be a little clearer about and more invested in what we can do to affect change by the end of this evening, and that will be better for what we hear tonight. I'm very excited and so honored for St. Anne and the Holy Trinity Church and Pro-Cathedral to share in hosting these women tonight. I want to thank my colleagues in the St. Mark's Deanery and the communities they serve at Grace Church, Brooklyn Heights, Christ Church, Cobble Hill, St. Paul's Carroll Gardens, Ascension Greenpoint, St. Luke and St. Matthew in Clinton Hill, St. John's in Park Slope, All Saints in Park Slope, Iglesia San Andres in Sunset Park, Christ Church in Bay Ridge, and St. Philip's in Dyker Heights. And I especially want to thank Mother Marie Tatro, who is a priest associate here at St. Anne's and the vicar for Community Justice Ministry in the Diocese of Long Island. She's been a partner and collaborator in preparing for this event and will help facilitate the question and answer period following the conversation between Dr. Meeks and Ms. Ritchie. And let me say, before I turn this over, that there is a Q&A function in the webinar that you can use throughout the conversation. Please post your questions. There may be an opportunity to let you in to speak directly to the presenters, but we'll certainly want to get to your questions. We'll do our best, knowing that there are many of you and that we want to end at the scheduled time we announced we'd conclude at 8:30. I just want to finally add that we hosts, all of us, are led by a bishop and serve alongside colleagues and sister parishes working for a just future, who like us believe that the church and the larger faith community need to be informed by and informing the conversation about reimagining policing. Without further ado, I give you Dr. Catherine Meeks and Andrea Ritchie, who will take it from here. Thank you both so very much.
So shall I speak first?
Please do, Dr. Meeks.
So I just want to say how delighted I am to have an opportunity to engage this conversation. And I am the executive director of the Absalom Jones Episcopal Center for Racial Healing in Atlanta. I'm a retired college professor. I have 2 sons, and I'm deeply interested in racial justice and healing and every aspect of that work, how injustice is exemplified in our country. And policing is one of those places where there's a great exemplification of racial injustice and inequity. So I'm completely preoccupied with that issue right now. And my work of 50 years has been about trying to figure out ways to be liberated myself and make sure that I could help other people find a path to liberation. So Andrea?
Where did you teach, Dr. Meeks?
I taught at Mercer University in Macon, Georgia, and Wesleyan College, which is a women's college.
I've been there.
And for the last 9 years of my career. And now as a 74-year-old, I have a completely new career running this center. And it's not new really because I was always doing this work, but now just get to do this. So it's both heartening and wonderful and sobering and horrible and a whole bunch of things all together.
I'm going to ask you more about the center in a second, but I'll let folks know who I am. I'm Andrea Ritchie. I was baptized Unitarian. I was confirmed Anglican, which is, I guess, the Canadian version of Episcopalian, and I'm lapsed at both. Although Mother Marie keeps me in line occasionally. And I mean, I often feel called to tell people not only sort of my credentials and the work that I do, but who I am. And I'm a Black woman, I'm a lesbian, I'm an immigrant. And I say all those things because one might necessarily know those things from looking at me, but also because they deeply shape the work that I do. I'm also a survivor of interpersonal violence and police violence. And then, you know, I'm all the other things that we said. You know, I'm an attorney, I'm an advocate, I'm an organizer, I'm a rabble-rouser, and a manure disturber, I think is how we say it in church. And I have been doing that around issues of policing since, let's say Rodney King was the first time I hit the streets, and was actually part of a huge demonstration in Canada, which most people don't know what impact that had in Canada. We had the biggest demonstration in Canadian history at that time around the non-indictment of the officers who killed Rodney King. But at the same time, there were around the same time, there were 2 Black Jamaican women in Toronto, one of whom was shot by police and one of whom was strip searched on a street corner, a very public street corner. Imagine the most public street corner in your community. And these police officers just walked up on this middle-aged Jamaican woman, probably around my age now, and told her to take off her shirt. And when she shocked asked them why, they said because they thought she was hiding drugs. And they just said, you just look like a drug dealer. And to me, you know, as someone who's like, wait, that could have been my auntie, that could have been my mom. My mom's Jamaican, my aunties and my cousins are Jamaican, and they could have either been shot because they were in a car that police thought were stolen, or they could have been strip searched like that in public and humiliated in public. At that point, I was sort of like, well, everyone's only talking about Rodney King, and there's a small group of Black women organizers who are talking about Rodney King and these 2 women, whose name was Sophia Cook and Audrey Smith. And so I thought, well, everybody should be talking about all 3. And so I just started researching and writing and talking and just sort of embarked on what became sort of a 25-year journey to make sure that when we're talking about policing, we're talking about it through the lens of everyone's experiences, that we're not just talking about it through the lens of Black men's experiences who are assumed to be heterosexual and who are assumed to not be transgender, because then we're going to miss a lot of the story about police violence, and then we're going to miss a lot of the solutions. So that's sort of been my trajectory. And, there's been some writing, there's been some lawsuits, there's been some defending protesters, there's been some, organizations and nonprofits and organizing along the way. But now I work with organizations around the country, supporting them around work to end criminalization, mass incarceration, and police violence ultimately. So,
and how wonderful to have you as an attorney with that attitude and that background, so that people can actually be really represented, because marginalized people have a hard time finding attorneys that can really represent them because they haven't worked out their own stuff.
Right.
And I just think that we are so good in this country about wanting to pick somebody and leave out other people, because I was pretty aggravated that we spent so much energy talking about George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, and you had to stop and make people remember Breonna Taylor. And that's just an example of our inability to see everybody as a worthy, equal person, I think. And it's completely aggravating. And I just think that's something we need to work on more intentionally.
No doubt about it. And then even fewer people know the name of Tony McDade, who was a Black transgender man who was killed the day after George Floyd in Tallahassee, Florida. And then and then even fewer know the name of let's say Kiwi Herring, who was a Black trans woman who was killed by police in St. Louis, or Kayla Moore was another Black trans woman who was killed by police. And so, if we don't know all the stories, then we won't be able to find all the solutions.
Right. And I'm equally, we'll go on to the rest of while we're talking, but the Native women that are being killed and are missing. And I find myself being just as concerned that it's almost as, yes, we've got the issue with African Americans and Latinx people, but anybody, a person of color or who's marginalized, you could be poor or have a mental health condition, and you're still in that category of expendable.
Exactly.
And so we need to be careful that we don't allow anybody to be expendable.
Exactly. So I'm curious about what the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Justice makes of this moment, of this uprising that we're in the middle of, and several dozen days into it. Feels like a long time. So what do you all make of this moment? Where are we?
Well, the Absalom Jones Center, it's really the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing, because I refuse to talk about racial reconciliation until we do the healing work. I think that people want to go too quickly to talking about reconciliation, and that offers them an opportunity to avoid dealing with the real issues and understanding there are no relationships to be reconciled here between the oppressed and the oppressor. Perhaps if we do the healing work, we can build some relationships in the future that would come out of doing that work. So we're 2.5 years old, and we have been working within the Episcopal Church primarily, because that's like 2.5 million people, and that's a pretty good constituency for a little center that's just getting started. But this moment of these this COVID pandemic, and then the kind of I don't know if I want to say explosion. I just think that people have come back out to say, look, enough is enough. And I don't know why in this particular moment, when we've got this other pandemic going on, but things always happen the way they're supposed to. So I just trust that we need to be trying to deal with all this at once. And it really got me thinking, okay, what's the most pressing issue that we can take up as a center that has to do with dealing with systemic racism? And I think that working on policing and reimagining it and reimagining public safety right now is the most important thing for us to be addressing, because it is so grounded in systemic racism, with even the whole history of the police, being put together to go capture slaves and bring them back. And then when they didn't have to do that anymore, to keep Black people in their place, and then to keep anybody else in their place that was a threat to white supremacy. So understanding that is critical, and I think a whole bunch of people don't understand it, including police people themselves, because I don't know how much real history they get taught. But I have two sons, and that are 35 and 34 and 39. And whenever my sons are not in their house, I'm not nearly as comfortable as I am when they're in the house, because of police and because of the ways in which policing is done in this country. So that's one reason to take this on in an evangelical way for me, an evangelistic way, I guess I should say, which means that I'm going to worry about it and worry everybody who will talk to me about, we got to do something. And so what I feel the center is taking this on as a major initiative. And what I've said is, until we do something that can actually save somebody's life, we're not going to pat ourselves on the back. We're not going to feel good. We're going to keep working relentlessly until we can see that we've actually created a little bitty space that might actually be safe. So I want so much to live in a place where we don't think that killing each other is an answer to anything, whether it's by police or people or just citizens who think that killing folks is what you need to do. I mean, I'm totally against guns. I think every gun on the planet needs to be melted down and gotten rid of. So, and of course, that's not a popular idea, I'm sure, with a lot of folks, but I'm against guns. I see no purpose in them. And I mean, you can find other ways to slaughter animals if you really got to kill animals. So, so in the light of all of that, how can our center be a catalyst is the question for me, and the question we're working with, be a catalyst for starting a new conversation, starting a new way to kind of look at what we're doing in our communities. I think we're not advanced enough in America that we could wake up in the morning and say, well, we could be like they do in Japan. My son lived in Japan for a while, and he said, Mama, you call a policeman in Japan and he shows up with a notebook, and to take an account of whatever your problem is, and you rarely see anybody with a gun. So I would like to see us have create a society that has less of a need for folks to be walking around with guns, with the notion that that's how you're supposed to be safe. I mean, the idea that a gun is what you need to keep people safe is a strange idea anyway, I think.
Yeah.
So
Definitely agree with you on that. And
yeah.
and there's so much in what you just said that I want to pick up on. I think I heard Ruby Sales, who was one of the freedom fighters who
right. I know her well.
Yes, exactly. I just heard her yesterday say something that really blew my mind, where she said, people say it started with slave patrols, but it didn't start with slave patrols. It started with the first person shackled into a slave ship hold. That actually, it goes so far as to the policing is not only rooted in the capture of enslaved people, but it's in the enslaving, actually, of Black people. It was brilliant what she said. And then what you were saying about...
Andrea, excuse me a second, but it's probably, even when you really think about it, it's probably in the beginning of the 15th century when the first Europeans showed up and decided they could kill the folks they found because they were extraneous to them. Exactly. Because all this boils down to, you can use violence to keep people in check that are somehow hindering you from being supreme.
Exactly.
So, anyway.
That's exactly what I was about to say, is that the other first police forces in the U.S. were called Indian constables, and they were designed to indigenous people out of white settlement areas. And then the other thing I learned in my research is that in the cities, the first police departments were set up basically to police gender and sexuality in public space, so that white women would not be offended. And so there would be laws against cross-dressing, there'd be laws against common night walker, which is, you or me out past a certain hour without a man. And there was also laws called ugly laws that were to keep disabled people out of public spaces. So as you're saying, the policing is always set up to maintain existing relations of power and to decide who's expendable and who's not. So often when people ask me, why did you pick policing to work on? It's very similar to the answer you gave around the center, which is that it feels like policing is the front line of relations of power and relations of injustice and relations of violence. And so for me, I want to be right at the front line of where that's happening. So it makes sense to me that you would want to center that work.
And given the, we did we did a 3-webinar series on reimagining policing, and we put them up on our national church website, not the website, but the Facebook page for people to broadcast them. And some of the negative comments that have come from people as if we have no right to take this issue up because we're Christians. And for me, it's an insane position that you have no right to take this up because you have faith. You have every right and responsibility to be taking up an issue such as this, first of all, that deals with the whole supremacy paradigm, but second of all, that threatens the life of citizens and people that put on uniforms. I mean, we're talking about a system that has too much capacity for killing to occur. And then I'm a person of faith and I'm not supposed to care about that. That doesn't, that's totally like, I don't know which book you've been reading, but it's not called the Bible like the one I read. So,
right. I definitely agree with you. My next question to you was going to be about where you see the role of communities of faith, because the one thing that I took away from the institutions that I no longer attend on a regular basis, is our responsibility for each other and our responsibility to a common core notion of justice, which would have nobody being killed or experiencing violence in the ways that you're describing. So the one thing I took away from all the church youth groups and all the things that I learned as an altar girl in the Anglican faith was that faith is about service, but faith is also about justice in this world. And I think what Mother Marie was just saying earlier in our conversation about, thank goodness that Jesus didn't think that we should stay away from issues of safety and justice, because then, he would have still be at the Sea of Galilee, I assume, and would not have done the journey that he did, and which, has influenced so many of us. So I think I'm really curious. And also I was struck by the fact that you were talking about the fact that the Episcopalian Church is a community of 2.5 million people. And how is it that we could say 2.5 million people are not responsible for our collective idea of what safety is and isn't? So what roles do you see faith communities playing in this question of what is safety and how do we build it together?
One of the I think that we need to engage in a lot of conversations about what our understanding of public safety really is. Because, people that are wedded to white supremacy in the suburbs will see their safety not in the same way as I'm going to see it in my community, or that will be seen in poor communities or communities that are challenged by the white supremacy issues that have created many of them. So I think that's a conversation that we need to be engaging, and we need to be engaging it from the perspective that everybody is a beloved child of God and everybody deserves to be able to be safe and to feel safe and not to have to be threatened either by other people or by somebody who's called law enforcement, So, and it's a conversation that I see our center helping to forge, because it's not one that folks are just going to readily step up to the plate for. I'm realizing that as I watch the comments that's coming back just from our little set of webinars that we've done, that there are many people who do know that we need to be taking this subject up. There are many people who think, oh, it's politics, it's the world, and we're spiritual, and we should. Somebody even said you ought to be talking to people about Jesus, and I said, well, we are. When we're talking about this, we are talking about Jesus, the peacemaker. You heard of him. But also, I mean, based on my reading the story, Jesus was a victim of police violence. He was a victim of police brutality, right. As far as I know. What do you think crucifixion is?
But even all the beatings on the way to the crucifixion, I mean, I feel
yes, absolutely. So I just think that that people of faith need to, whether they're Episcopalians or not, need to try to figure out, what does that really mean for them? And if they've decided that there's some people that are more valuable than other people, then they've got a big mistaken notion about who humanity is. and that's a serious problem to start with. And so it follows that they'll have other problems if they think that they're first and second and third class citizens. And a lot of what we say and do really reflects that, even though we're claiming everybody's created in God's image. We don't really believe it and don't practice it for a half a minute. Because if we did, there are lots of things that would be totally intolerable to us. And one of them would be for any of our sisters and brothers to be oppressed and harassed and mistreated. That should be intolerable to everybody. And it's not, because there are people who can talk themselves into believing that some people deserve to be treated poorly because of their circumstances and all that. So I hope that part of the work that we do will interrupt that conversation, that negative conversation, and create some better conversations around what would public safety look like if we really actually cared about everybody.
I love that that's where you start the conversation, because I mean, when you say people, like the number one human concern is everybody wants to be safe. Everybody wants to be where they love to be safe, right? That's a basic human need and desire. And so how can we say that's not what our communities of faith are about, when that's what each of us individually and collectively is about? And then it does become whose safety at whose expense, that the question is that we're talking about. And does it have to be at someone's expense? Is it not possible for us as communities of faith, as people who use our imaginations a great deal, right? Like this whole, communion thing requires a lot of imagination, right? Like a lot of faith requires a lot of imagination. So why can't we put that imagination to also imagining how all of us could be safe, every being created by God? And that feels to me like where it's right to start the conversation, because I think often people instead sort of start it as, police or no police, or this kind of policing versus this kind of policing, or this or that. And it's really actually, if we start, and I particularly start from the place of, if Black women are safe, and that's Black women of all gender identities and all sexualities are safe, then all of us will be safe. Because we live at the intersections of so many forms of violence that if we could eliminate all the forms of violence that we experience, then everybody else would be in a much better place. And what I've learned in my research is that there's definitely a lot of places where police are not creating safety for Black women, queer and trans. They're creating more violence. So if I orient myself to what would create safety based on what I hear from people, some people say housing is the number one thing that would make me safe. It would keep me safe from domestic violence. It would keep me safe from trafficking. It would keep me safe from living in conditions that would give me breast cancer. It keeps me safe from, from being homeless on the street and then being targeted by people in wide open. Just being housed would be the number one thing that would create safety. But right now we're putting so much money into policing, and police who will then round up people who are homeless, or respond to domestic violence calls after the fact, or do other things that aren't preventing domestic violence, that aren't preventing other kinds of violence. They're just an after the fact response, that we're not putting enough money, it's literally looting money away from housing, which is a thing that people say they need to be safe. The other thing I hear people say they need to be safe is healthcare. They just need, when something happens, to have support, to have mental health support, to have physical health care, to be cared for. And so I think that when we start from that question of what makes us safe, the answer so often is actually not police.
That's right.
So
And people need transportation.
Right.
You don't have to be out walking at midnight whenever I'm driving somewhere late and see some person walking, male or female, by themselves. It always troubles me because I know the streets are not safe. And so people shouldn't have to be put in any situation that threatens their body, and you should be able to live your life without this is not the middle of a war zone somewhere, where you should be able to navigate your neighborhood without having to be violated by anybody, another citizen or somebody who is called law enforcement. We should work in this country to have a kind of respect for human beings and life that gets away from thinking violating people is a choice. And we have made that a choice in too many cases. And sometimes, I mean, there a handful of mitigating circumstances, like somebody's mentally ill and just out of control in some kind of way. But that's not the general rule. It's mostly people don't know how to solve problems. And because we are so addicted to violence, we resort to that before we ever have a chance to think through anything. I just saw a young police officer was murdered by her ex-boyfriend in Alabama this week, because though she had a restraining order and all that stuff, because his idea of how you solve a problem is to kill somebody. You know, how did we get to that? You know, and for me, that's a serious question that needs to be that I agonize over. That, you know, I understand that there's a lot of reasons to be broken and sad and a whole bunch of things, but how do you get to the only way I can solve a problem is to violate another person? And we do, you know, children and women and men. It's not just limited to women. It's and it's a commentary on us and our overall health as a nation, I think. And whether can we imagine ourselves as a nation of people who actually can be well?
Right.
Is
Well,
a question I wonder.
absolutely. I think, and I wonder if we can imagine ourselves as a nation where everyone's needs are met, so that people aren't feeling like they're in a war zone and that it's life or death every day, and that they're not, and that people aren't forced into criminalized economies where the only way to resolve a dispute is with violence, because you can't go to the weed board and be like, I had this corner and I was feeding my family off this corner, and this person came, and I would like for us to figure out how to share the corner so that we can both make a living for our family. Like, there's no place you can go do that. So we're forced into, you know, there's a lot of research that shows that, you know, the drug trade is violent because it's criminalized. It's not violent inherently, because there's liquor trade, which just seems to be fine as a regulated, non-criminalized activity, right? But it was very violent under prohibition. So it's about our response can create the violence. And then I think around this question of domestic violence, what if as a society we were all so deeply invested in everyone's safety in that situation that the first moment there was a shift in the power dynamic in that relationship that was looking like it was not respecting everyone's, you know, well-being, all of us, including faith communities, this is our role, right? Stepped in and said, sister, brother, sibling, cousin. The way you spoke to your partner the other night concerned me. It seemed that you were punishing her for something that was about you asserting power over her. Why did you feel like you needed to assert power over the person that you love and care about? And that, you know, others of us went to the other person and said, I didn't like the way homeboy talked to you. What's going on? How is it feeling at home? There's no shame in this. We're all responsible together for the conditions of our community. And if you need to take a break from that relationship, you can come stay here, or we have a nice house over here for you all by yourself. You don't have to be in some kind of congregate or family situation, right? And let's talk together. Let's talk about how as a community we're setting up these power dynamics, and we're valuing people who punish others, and we're shaming people who are punished in such a way that no one wants to talk about it until suddenly somebody's dead, and we're all like, how could that happen? They always seem so nice, you know? I mean, there's so many things. I often talk about, you know, that gymnast coach, Larry Nasser, who violated so many girls. And I often wonder, you know, what would have happened if when the first girl said, I don't like the way coach touched me, if at that moment we all stopped and said, what's happening here? You know, like, yes, the Olympics is important, gymnastics is important, and this child's bodily integrity is also important. Then we wouldn't be thinking about how many years he should do in prison after he's violated hundreds of girls. We would be thinking in that moment, maybe you're not the best person to coach in this way.
That's
maybe find another way for you to support these girls that doesn't put you in a position that you can do this kind of thing until you get your act together.
And you know what occurs to me as you're talking about that kind of way of imagining life, it says so much about why we want a police force in the first place, because we want to turn over all of those necessities to act like loving people toward one another.
Exactly.
We don't want to be bothered with that. And then when things go awry, we just want somebody we can call to come fix it and put it back get things back to order, rather than we're never ready to start with those earlier questions that need to be asked about things. We, don't bother me with all of the complications here. I just want this cut and dried. So rather than engaging people and being involved with people and being the community and being the church, really,
Exactly.
that we're called to be, it's easier to just sort of let it all go and then have this group of people we've designated, and we pay them not hardly enough money to live a lot of times, to do what we don't want to do, really.
And also what they're not equipped to do, right? I mean,
absolutely, and shouldn't be asked to do.
Exactly.
So yeah.
Community and family is what that's about. And also in faith communities, I mean, we are all about each other's business in ways that are not helpful, right? Like who said what at the vestry meeting, and who made the cookies and the tea when she makes it is not as good as my tea. Like can we not be in each other's business in ways that are more productive and actually about
that might save somebody's life.
Exactly.
That might save somebody's life. And I get, it worries me, but this whole new conversation is, well, it's not new really, but it's been enlarged, I guess, because of the recent killings. And I'm actually trying to wrap my head around why people are having such an extraordinary reaction, it seems, to George Floyd's murder. And I'm guessing it's because we watched somebody kill somebody in real time on television. And I think that has not happened. I mean, we have watched videos of people being shot in the back or whatever, but to watch somebody for that amount of time actually killing another human being, I think it just touched something that hadn't been touched before, at least in that way. But it seems to me that the conversation we always started in the wrong place. I mean, here we have created this world that has gotten us to this place, and it goes back to all the stuff we've already been talking about, and the grounding in the white supremacy paradigm, and yet we want to fix it with one simple little thing. And it's not a pull a thread and we can unravel this and be okay. We do really have to be willing, I think, to invest in the long-term, digging up the foundation and making something new. And I feel like that most of the time that we, particularly in the United States, not ready to make things new. We just want to get it. We want to get something we can live with, and we can't live with this. We cannot live with this structure that we've got. We have got to work on creating a new narrative, a new structure, a new way to do things if we want to keep on going. And I feel like that there's nothing else more important than that to address, and that if we work on it in all the ways we need to, we will deconstruct a lot of other stuff, which helped to get us here in the first place.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I think my answer to your question about, why did George Floyd spark this brings me back to what you were saying earlier about where we are in terms of this pandemic and the rise of white supremacy and fascism in the US in this moment. And I think for me, I've been talking about it as like a triple pandemic, right? There was COVID, which I don't know about you, but that was a swerve I did not expect. I did not see that coming. I did not, it wasn't in my, fears about the future. I didn't understand.
Right.
Other people knew, but I didn't know. And so and then the rate of devastation and decimation in Black communities that illuminated, that just revealed as starkly as possible the impact of the structural disparities that you're talking about. And then the response, which in New York, the first thing the governor did after the pandemic was pass a budget that cut Medicaid. Cut Medicaid,
oh, really?
Cut healthcare in the middle of a pandemic. And then the next thing that happens is, yes, we see a video, and I'm sad to tell you there are so many videos of police officers killing people online that you can watch. It's horrifying. But this one definitely, I think, struck a chord because, Eric Garner, you can watch police officers choke Eric Garner to death online, right? Saying, I can't breathe. I could tell you many others, and I won't. But I think what happened in that moment was people saw a city that had adopted every single reform that was considered the best practices, the gold standard, the progressive kinds of policing, community policing. That cop who suffocated George Floyd to death while he begged for his life and his breath, had been to de-escalation training. He had been to all the things that we're supposed to do. And I think people after Ferguson really there's been many iterations, right, of reform. In fact, since policing has been founded and since prisons have been founded, they've been in a constant state of reform or reimagining or a new kind of publicity thing. But in this moment, people since Ferguson had really tried to think about how to make policing not kill Black people. And I think that then what people saw was, in the face of all of that, this cop will just stare a young Black woman, because it was a young Black woman who was filming him, in the face, impassively, hands in pockets, all the rules, knowing that he's violating them, all the cops around him turning their back and letting it happen, all the bystanders screaming to stop, that he can't breathe, that he's not resisting, there's nothing wrong, what's happening, and just kill him. And I think people were like, okay, so there's a pandemic of anti-Black police violence. We're clear on that. But now they're cutting our healthcare. We're dying in a pandemic. They're cutting our healthcare, and they're putting money to these people who are literally with their knee on our necks, and they're sending us $1,200 to survive on for months in the middle of the biggest economic crisis of our generation. And I think that's, so I think when you're saying people don't, I think you're absolutely right that people in the US kind of want to, kind of figure out how to tinker and kind of basically keep things the same. But I think there's moments in history when people say, no, wait, this is absolutely
enough.
Enough is enough. And I think the abolition of slavery obviously was one, but I think this moment we're at a tipping point where people are saying, this is not, nobody's safe. None of us feel safe. And we're pouring $100 billion a year into something that's not helping us feel safe, that is taking away money from the things that would make us feel safe. And that in this moment are literally about life and death. Like, I think this uprising is about Black people saying, we're not just going to lay down and die from COVID, from police violence, or from starvation. Like, we're just not doing it. And we're demanding a better vision of safety. And so I really, in that moment, feel like there's such a huge role for faith communities, because it's already a created community, right? We've seen so many mutual aid projects spring up where people are sort of looking at existing communities with neighbors and how to help each other. Faith communities are there already. So you're really a place, and I'm so grateful for the work of your center. This is really a place where we can practice what our faith tells us about what loving each other is about, while we think about what safety really looks like in this particular context, right? COVID, economic crisis, and a decision that we cannot go on with what we're calling public safety anymore.
And I think we can't get away with these little kind of too oversimplified answers to these complex problems that we've got to dig up the ground here underneath ourselves and say, look, this is a bad root system, and we've got to do something about it, and we need to do something real. And police people who take on jobs as police officers, many of them want to be public servants. I mean, they want to go help somebody. Some of them don't, but many of them do. And then they get off into the system and they start drinking the blue Kool-Aid, and before you know it, they just don't quite know which ends up. So all of that's part of the complexity of it, and that's part of what we got to start talking about and thinking about. And this is not the work that I was imagining myself doing right this minute, but it's the only work that this center can do right this minute. And we have to step up to that plate and say that we can't just act like none of this is happening, and there's no putting your head down and thinking you're going to make it till the pandemic is over and then we'll just go back to somewhere, because there's nowhere to go back to. We can only go forward, and we need to go forward with a different set of attitudes and embracing these questions that need to be being asked now, because we have been through this period. And Black and brown people and poor people are a little bit sick and tired of just being pushed to the margin and bulldozed into the ditch. I mean, there's gonna be, I think that all of us have to recognize that sooner or later, people will stand up and just refuse to let you just completely erase them.
It's what's happening now.
And that's right. And so, someone was just telling me today, that someone at their church was saying they didn't think that systemic racism was a real thing. And I'm thinking, where do you live? I mean, honestly, how do you as a thinking adult live in this country and not understand that racism is systemic and institutionalized and really feeding so much of how we interact with each other? And this particular person happens to be in a church where 60% of the people who are parishioners are mentally not well and people of color. And you think that just happened because their parents didn't do something right, or that, or something. I mean, what,
people just individualize the problem. I mean, I think what you're saying, like, to me, just the way in which anti-Blackness runs so deep in our thinking, and the way in which the world is framed or conceived, that and the individualization of all these problems, including the high death rates in Black communities. When I hear people say, well, Black people are dying of COVID because Black people have higher rates of asthma or high blood pressure, or this and that and the other, I'm like, well, how do you think that happened? How do you think that happened? It's because they cited the dump in our communities, and then it's stressful to wonder every day, as you were saying, whether your sons are going to come home, and that'll send your blood pressure up, right? And I would add to that your sons should be worried about you too. And
well, they are. One day I told my son, we were at dinner, and I was talking about, that was when a woman had been kidnapped and killed in New Orleans, who was an activist, an elderly woman, that her renter killed her. You might remember that story. She was trying to collect rent from this man, and he took her off and killed her. And I was saying, but I don't worry about myself that much, because I'm mostly talking in churches and mostly talking to religious groups of people. And my youngest son just had an explosion, and he banged on the table and he said, well, that's fine. You don't have to worry, because I worry enough for both of us. And it just made, and I thought, oh my God, I have run around here feeling pretty brave and safe myself, because I'm an old lady and I figure I'm okay. And these kids are here worrying because I'm out here standing up saying the stuff I'm saying, and it is legitimate. It is legitimate.
But also because, who did Dylan Roof kill? Dylan Roof killed Black women.
It doesn't matter if you're old or young, because the hatred is the hatred. So
exactly. And Katherine Johnson was a Black woman, a 92-year-old Black woman who was killed by Atlanta police, right?
That's right, because they had the wrong house or something.
Drug war, same thing as Breonna Taylor, no-knock drug raid, right? So many Black women are killed by no-knock drug raids, where, I mean, the war on drugs is it's deadly to Black women and everybody involved.
And I think that's the kind of stuff that all of those things grew out of this racist idea that Black folks are somehow, and brown folks, are worse than white folks. And so we got to do all these things to keep us all in check. And so if you build a system on that paradigm, then the system is not going to ever work in favor of the folks that you built it. Well, it's doing what it was designed to do. It's just that what it was designed to do is unacceptable.
And it has like a propaganda machine that keeps us believing that that's the natural order of things, and that's the way it should be, and it's about individual problems, and we don't even see obviously on Fox News that's happening, right? And we see that maybe more visibly. But it's also happening on MSNBC, or it's happening on, NPR, or it's happening even in our own families. I mean, in our own families, there's colorism, there's, heterosexism, there's homophobia, and so there's so many ways in which we are ableism, and there's so many ways in which we are replicating those things and have to unlearn them ourselves in this practice of safety. So I think that, to me, is part of the essential thing, and also part of what takes us to one last thing that our hosts wanted us to talk about before we go to questions, which is specifically this question of defunding police and what we're looking for. So we've talked a little bit about, yes, if housing is what gives people safety, why don't we put money in housing instead of paying cops to round people up who don't have housing? But I think that I helped some colleagues and I put together a toolkit that talked about defunding not just being about a budgetary exercise and moving money from one side to the other, but it's also an exercise in asking this question, what actually produces safety, and recognizing that in so many instances, police don't, and they produce more violence, and that we need to reduce the scope of police contact. We need to reduce the equipment that police have, the guns, the SWAT raid, equipment, the pepper spray and the taser that they attacked that couple with in Atlanta, who were stopped at a traffic light. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, just all those toys, people that who are addicted to punishment, as you're saying, or addicted to violence. And I would say as a society, we're addicted to punishment, want to end up using to secure compliance. And then also to just really question legitimacy of like this question that you said right at the beginning is when we respond to violence, we think using violence, we're addicted to violence, and we think violence is going to stop violence. And it never does. Because if we include police violence in what we think of as violence, then adding more of that is not going to stop violence. It's only going to increase it, right? So, So I wonder how you're seeing the efforts to defund the police in Atlanta or in other faith community or in other communities that you're connected to through the center, and how you're seeing faith communities sort of lift that demand up.
Well, what I think, it just goes back to what I said before. We always go at stuff from the wrong end of it. If we have a conversation about what constitutes public safety, and then we realize that public safety is about housing and healthcare and transportation and grocery stores and decent schools, and we start working on making that happen, it will become just a kind of almost a natural thing that there will be far less folks running around in uniforms because they totally won't be necessary.
Exactly.
And number one. And number two, what are the jobs that police are doing that really are about other things, like with the housing issue, when people say, I can't imagine what it's like to be outdoors all the time and have no way to protect yourself from whatever decides to violate you. You're just at the mercy. When I drive all around and I see people that are living outdoors, and it just breaks my heart, partially because of safety. I know it's horrible to sleep on the ground, I'm sure, but then you have no safety. You have no, well, if we stop having people living outdoors, we don't need police officers to be picking up people that are living outdoors. So that reduces the number, and the money goes somewhere else. So if we would ask the right questions and allocate money to answer those questions, those needs, those things that we decided were important, defunding police forces would not even be defunding police forces. It would be creating public safety and reallocating money to make public safety the rule rather than some kind of exception. But folks can't stay in the conversation long enough to get anywhere with it. So we just want to stand on our opposite sides and throw stuff at folks instead of saying, let's have a real conversation. The same way I feel about reparations. I'm sick of the stupid conversation that starts with, well, are we going to give Barack Obama a check? Well, no, we're not. But what we're going to do is make the country a safer place for the descendants of slaves so they can live their lives with and become whoever God put them on the earth to be. And then if you create a world where that's happened, you will have done the repairing of the breach. And nobody will care whether you give them a check or not, because they can make their own check. They just need to have the opportunity and accessibility and an opportunity to live their lives to the fullest extent. And we so much don't want to do what's right until we keep coming up with all the things to stop ourselves, So we stay in this debate about, well, you want to abolish the police? Well, then we can't talk. Well, no, what I want is for you to create a world where everybody's safe. And in the process of that, it's not even abolishing. You don't need them anymore. It's like you become obsolete because you're not needed.
Right. We've created a society where violence is not possible, or if harm occurs, because we're humans, we're likely to harm each other. But when harm occurs, there's an immediate response that's holistic, that's not punitive, that's transformative, that contains accountability. I just want to be clear that abolition doesn't mean no accountability, but it actually means accountability that will repair in the way that you're talking about, as opposed to produce more violence and punishment and not any repair or healing. And I think that is important. And when you talk about reparations, that's feels to me like a really good model, actually, because there's so much more to reparations than a check, right? There's
Yeah.
an acknowledgement, right? An acknowledgement which requires sort of saying someone, I see your pain, I see your humanity, and it was violated here. And that in and of itself is healing. There has to be non-repetition. So we have to, as a society, say, how did this happen? And how do we stop it from happening again? And there has to be an immediate cessation, which means the ongoing after effects of slavery that led, for instance, Amadou Diallo to be killed. The police didn't stop him and say, are you descended from enslaved people who were in America? Or are you an African migrant? They just said, you black, and we're shooting you, right? Like, and so what are the after effects of slavery, and how do we cease those impacts right away and then make sure they don't repeat? That's a transformation of society, as you say, that will produce more safety for everyone. And is so much more than a check. And so I feel like reparations is such an important model for us to use in interpersonal, but also in systemic harm that can really help us grapple with that. And I think that faith communities can play a huge role. In Canada, I've seen faith communities, including the equivalent, the Anglican Church, play a huge role both in acknowledging their own role in the case of Canada in the oppression of Indigenous peoples through Indian residential schools, and making reparations in that way, including a check, but not only a check, and in calling on other churches and other institutions and on governments to make reparations, and modeling as people of faith what reparations looks like and should be. And so I hope that there's a similar role, and I know that your center is going to make it happen. We're going to
try. We're going to make people miserable if they in the process of trying. And I really do think that's what the church is supposed to be, creating the space so the kingdom of God can be manifest on the earth. And we are so far removed from understanding ourselves in that role because we're so busy claiming that work is political when that is our work, and we got ourselves confused about what we're supposed to be doing. So we need to be out here night and day, creating a world where everybody we can see the face of God in each other. That's what we say. That's what the baptismal covenant says, is that we will restore and make sure that we recognize the dignity in everybody. And you can't have dignity when you have to live under a bridge and people can harass you and do anything to you. And I, as a person of faith, should not be comfortable until every one of those people has somewhere to sleep that's safe. And if I had that attitude, then I won't be sitting up worrying about, is it political or if it's this or that, but what is happening to my sister or my brother? So we just got to quit asking the wrong questions and then starting all little debates around the wrong questions, and I'm so fed up with it. I mean, it's just
you're about to make me come back to church, Dr. Meeks. I don't know.
Well, I would be glad for you to come down to Atlanta, and we can do some disrupting together. So
speaking of questions, the right ones and otherwise, all good. We've got some from our attendees, from our participants, that we want to be sure to share. It's a little after 8 o'clock, and so I'm going to turn this over to Marie and let her facilitate this last part of our event.
All right.
Okay. I'm kind of looking in a couple different places. People are posting things in the chat and the Q&A, so give me a minute.
Okay.
Can I answer the first one?
Yeah, go for it. Oh, you can see them all too?
I can. And
I'm not looking at them, so you'll have to tell me.
Okay, so the first one is one that is like my pet peeve, and I really want to answer it, which is the notion that Black men are less safe than Black women in so many ways. And so what I reached for is the Movement for Black Lives, which I'm privileged to be on the policy table of, recently reissued the Vision for Black Lives. And there is a brief, and I'll drop it in the chat, called End the War on Black Women, which outlines in excruciating detail all the ways in which this is a myth, that Black women are okay, we're doing okay, and it's Black men who are really at the greatest risk of everything. Black women have the highest poverty rates, along with Native women, of any group. Black women are the group most likely to be killed by police when unarmed than any group. which doesn't mean that the numbers are highest, but it's most likely to happen to a Black woman when she's unarmed. So police see Black women like Sandra Bland, for instance, who's just saying, why you give me a parking ticket, as a deadly threat more often than they do for Black men. I could list off all these other statistics, but economically, health-wise, and in terms of police interactions, Black women are doing equally poorly or much worse than Black men in every category. So I'll drop rather than go off on my numbers, I'll drop the link in the chat. But I feel like this myth that Black women are doing better than Black men is part of, and is part of misogyny. It's part of anti-Black women misogyny. The notion that we're okay and we're carrying everybody else and everyone else is doing worse than us is part of what we need to uproot in order to end the conditions we're talking about. So that was the one I really wanted to jump in and talk about.
Well,
Carry on, Marie.
And I agree with you completely about that whole, the misogynistic piece of that, because I guess some of that got started because Black women were able to run interference for the families and make sacrifices and do all these things. And so this misperception of us as Wonder Woman got started, and no regard really for us as women. It was almost like we were other than women. I mean, you know, we're kind of, and so we just get knocked around from a whole bunch of different perspectives because of that. And it's something to never be quiet about.
Yes.
Sorry,
Thank you.
Marie. Thank you.
Go ahead.
That's okay. That's okay. I do have a little note from a colleague of mine, not a colleague, but a ecumenical partner on Long Island who would love to get this toolkit that you referenced. She put her email there, but if you want to just send it to me, I can forward it to her if you're able to share that. And I also see a question from one of our parishioners who does a lot of racial justice work, and he is himself a retired police officer. And he's asking, what do you envision in a reimagined policing model? Will social workers, mental health workers be available 24/7 and be able to respond to violent domestic situations or an ill person who's been off their meds and so on? And he notes his question is sincere, and I can tell you, I know him, and he is very sincere in his work and trying to sort this out. Can you address some of? I know those are like kind of very particular kind of policy questions or program questions, but if you can, that would be great.
I also saw that the same person was talking about the 21st century policing task force, which I testified in front of that task force, and I think that was really part of this good faith effort to really think about how to reduce the harms of policing post-Ferguson. And again, I think what struck everyone about Minneapolis is Minneapolis did everything that task force said, and George Floyd is still dead over a $20 bill. And so I think that's why people are just like, okay, we're done. Like that, now we need something different. I think there are some things that don't require a police response. The majority of 911 calls I've been looking at in a number of cities are about loud noise, about suspicious person, which is, anti-Black, right? There's a Black man. I've literally lived in homes in an apartment building where there was a sign up saying there was a Black man in the backyard of the apartment building. I was just like, I just tore the sign down. I'm like, because the world is in our backyard, we can't, not everyone Black is suspicious, right? Or we all saw the instance of Amy Cooper calling the cops on someone and saying that someone's suspicious as a way of wielding power. So some things, littering right now in New York City is an offense. Drinking open container is an offense. Some things don't require a police response at all. Some of the things that the mental health workers, I think we have to sort of step back from the moment of crisis and think that if everyone's mental health needs were met through universally available, no-cost, community-based mental health treatment that was available in many forms, right? Like, I want to go to church to get my mental health care. I don't want to go to church to get my mental health care. I want to go to this place to get mental health care. Whatever it is, and it was freely available. And that there was a program in New York called Parachute NYC, where if someone felt a mental health crisis coming on, they're like, oh, I'm hearing those voices again, or I can feel like people know when manic episodes are coming on or whatever, they could walk into a place and get respite. And they wouldn't be locked down. They wouldn't be forced medicated. Nothing against their will. And there would be peers who also struggle with mental health issues who would work with them, and they could decide what happened. And that made people much more willing to go in earlier before it was a crisis moment and get help and leave freely without anything ever having get into the crisis than the current system where you have to say, I need to lock myself into this place for 72 hours to get help. And I may not get out until the doctor decides I'm okay to leave. And no one's going to want to do that. So they're going to stay away until a crisis appears. So I think that there's some ways we have to back up from the point of crisis. And the same with domestic violence. I think we described earlier, like how we could see domestic violence coming and see if there's a way we could intervene early. Because 43% of people who experience domestic violence don't call the cops now. And 2/3 of people who experience sexual violence don't ever tell anybody. Anybody. So right now we're leaving behind almost half of DV survivors and 3/4 of sexual assault survivors. So there's people who are trying to address that and they're grossly underfunded while we're putting 100 million. And some of them are the church. Some faith communities are addressing it and they're not getting the funding to do it, but we're spending $100 billion a year to do it. So I think for me, I want to stop assuming that there needs to be an alternative for each thing that the police do now. I want us to go deeper and reimagine, like, how could we make it so that there wasn't a need for a response or that we had a very different response?
Well, and a lot of people that end up with at a crisis point where some mental health issues are there were other things that contributed to that too, because many times there's poverty and a whole bunch of other pressures that there was no way to answer those issues, and it just keeps rolling and it ends up to be this big explosion. But if there were more community resources and people could walk down the street and get some help, as you were describing, for their if they felt their illness acting up, but or some relief from the other things that might be impinging upon them, then that they may never would get to that place either where somebody has to call the police. Because I think it's really a sad situation for a family member to think they have to call the police on another family member who has a mental health problem. There are other problems in that family that are way deeper than that, and they've been missed along the way. So now everything's escalated and gotten out of hand. And that, as Andrea and I have been saying for this last hour, that results from us never really digging deep and trying to really ask the right questions and build real solutions rather than just doing quick stuff. You know, we ready to cut mental health services, and we don't care what happens to poor folks and marginalized people. And so when they act up, we'll just arrest them or kill them or whatever we have to do. And we don't have the apparatus beforehand to deal with that. It's like deciding little kids acting up in the 3rd grade are going to end up in prison. So you start building prison beds instead of doing, how do you save a 3rd grader? I mean, why are you going to project him into prison when you could figure out how to save him way back, or her way back here? So, you know, I mean, I think that people of faith have got to we got to separate ourselves from this oversimplified thinking and really think harder and deeper and about all of these things. So, and I so agree with you that we don't need to sit trying to find, what are we going to do about the folks who call because their cats are in the tree, and who's going to get them down? We need to work on what is public safety and welfare going to look like. And then what are all the pieces that need to happen for that to happen? Because all that other stuff is, again, another way to short circuit the real work. And we're so good at that. I mean, that's the part that I just get so weary of. Let's try to do real stuff.
All right. Well, Dr. Meeks, I'm going to make
I'm supposed to not be talking that much, right? Because we are.
It's fantastic. I'm going to make you a little more weary and just sort of condense some of the questions that are flying around, just sort of about the role of the church. Looking at the macro and the micro, right? Say, like, what can we do as a national church to sort of make an impact? How should we be addressing this? And then there's more of a micro question from one of my Episcopal colleagues in Brooklyn that is saying, in your experience, what pitfalls do you see well-meaning parish communities falling into that you would warn against as they dig deeper into the work of racial justice? And I know, Dr. Meeks, you know a fair bit about our diocese, that it's incredibly diverse and very wonderfully complicated. And we have a lot of all Caribbean churches. We have a few all white churches. We have a lot of mixed churches, and sort of doing this work when people are coming from so many different lived experiences. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the micro stuff, but maybe also the national church macro.
Well, and I'll try to be brief. I'll be briefer because we don't have much time left. The first thing we got to do is learn how to listen, how to ask better questions and listen, because we go out with our prescription that we made up, and it's got nothing to do with the illness that we're trying to fix. So I think churches need to, parishes, I would like to see parishes take on the mantle of creating spaces for conversations between people in the community and all of everybody in the community. So you bring in the people that are living without shelter, you bring in the marginalized people, you bring in law enforcement, you bring in everybody, because the church ought to be able to navigate a conversation with all of those people being represented. That's what we're supposed to be about. And then you talk to folks and you listen to what they say about what they want and what they need, and you try to work from that perspective rather than sitting in a meeting somewhere and deciding that you're going to have a neighborhood cleanup or whatever. I mean, that's what we end up making a decision about, what we think the answer is, before we've ever asked anybody the question that we're trying to fix the problem for. So that's what I think on the micro level. I wish that parishes would look into where the precincts are in their neighborhoods and reach out to them and get involved, so that your voice becomes a part of the conversation that's going on, or you are creating a conversation if it's not going on. And as far as the big church, we need to step up to the plate. We need to step up to the plate. The Episcopal Church needs to step up to the plate and declare that reimagining policing and public safety is maybe the most apt way right at this moment to deal with systemic racism, and that we're going to put our shoulders to that plow. And I have got the presiding bishop to agree to be on a webinar with me where we have a conversation about this in October, because
that's great.
And I've met with the bishops, all 15 of the 20 bishops in Province 4 around this same issue, because we've got to stop hiding under the bed about this, what this is all about as a faith communion. And I want to, I told the bishops I was going to worry them to death, and I mean to stick to that. I promise.
That's great. I was going to next address a question to Andrea, but it looks like she sort of she wrote it in the Q&A, but maybe you could, for folks who maybe have a hard time accessing it, can you summarize? The question was raised by a dear friend of mine and also a community partner in Long Island. Says, I agree with your analyses of the systemic racism in our policing, but I also know that Trump is politicizing your analyses to make his case that police reformers want to abolish the police by defunding them, thereby putting us all at risk. His TV ads showing 911 operators as recordings because the police are gone are Exhibit A. How do we counter this lie? I mean, I think that's a great question, and Andrea, your response was wonderful, but maybe you could do it out loud for the rest of the participants.
Yeah.
Sure. As you can tell, it's not my first Zoom rodeo.
Oh yeah.
I mean, first of all, most 911 calls that people make aren't answered, right? Like, I mean, in Black communities, I mean, this Public Enemy song that 911 is a joke or a Tracy Chapman song that like always come late if they come at all, those were songs when I was growing up. Maybe there's new ones now, but those are realities, right? On the south side of Chicago, people call desperately as people bleed out and can't even get like a hospital or an ambulance or a police officer to come, right? So that's one thing. Like all the violence that's happening now is happening with fully funded police departments. It's happening with $100 billion a year on police departments. What if we address the root cause of what the 911 call is coming from, so that the call wouldn't have to happen at all, is one thing. And then what if we also addressed it in a less expensive way? Like, for many people, as Dr. Meeks was talking about, the parent who calls the police because their child is having a mental health crisis, there's no one else to call in most communities. In most communities, the only government service available is the police, and they barely show up. So that's why so many communities sometimes are saying, we want more police, not less. But what they're really saying, I think, and I'm not trying to speak for anyone, but my understanding of that is we want more safety. We want more resources. And because the only one that you're offering us is police, then we're going to say more police. But what if we said, actually, I just want someone to show up. My child is having a mental health crisis and I'm at my wit's end. And what if we had surrounded that parent with so many supports, and so many of us in the building knew what to do, and we could step in and be like, you know what? I feel it. Like, today you're at the end of your rope. You're done. I'm here. Take a walk. I know the skills. You've trained me how to work with your kid. I had a good night's sleep last night. I can step in. Or the EMT down the hall, or the nurse upstairs, or the doctor down the street feels like they can step in. That's the answer around the 911 calls, is that there's ways of doing it more cheaply and less risk of violence. Because now when a parent calls to find out, to get help if their kid has a mental health crisis, they have to face the fact that 1/2 to 2/3 of people who were killed by police are or were believed to be in a mental health crisis at the time. So they have to take the risk. But unfortunately, the cops might show up and their child might wind up dead. And that's a terrible dilemma to put someone in. Like, I can't deal with what's happening, and if I call, I might get help or I might get violence. And that happens to DV survivors too. They might get beaten or sexually assaulted by cops, or they might get help, or they might get nothing. And either way, the police are arriving after the fact and they're not presenting anything. So I think I'm trying to think of like how to say it in like a succinct way to deal with those like ads, which are very powerful. But I think the answer is to show that to create an ad where we've created a situation where there's no need for 911 calls. Or if there is, we have them answered by people who are much more able to deal with the problem more efficiently and more effectively.
Yeah, and make sure that a gazillion people go to vote. That's the best way to deal with them.
Yeah. So there's another question from a parishioner and also a friend of mine who is kind of at an intersection of the two of you. She's a very faithful Episcopalian and very involved in her church in Brooklyn, but she's also a human rights attorney. And she has a lot of ideas and plans, I know. And she's asking, how do we make reform about reimagining communities first and foremost, with police only one of many interests? And how can the churches set that as the agenda and ignite action toward establishing that new kind of community? I think that's kind of directed at both of you, but you all can decide.
Well, I mean,
I think that's in the chat. If you
to
see
remake the United States of America is what that question is about, really, to be a just place for marginalized people. And when white people decide that they're willing to give up the benefits of white supremacy enough so that everybody can have what they need, then we'll start seeing some of that happen. And we in the Episcopal Church, which is in the United States, a highly composed of large numbers of white people, so we could start in our own communion talking about what are the benefits of white supremacy that we're willing to give up so everybody can have what they need. I mean, for me, that is the primary question that needs to be answered, because the systems keep being reinforced because people don't want to give up their privilege and power and commitment, the benefits of supremacy. And so the decision has to be made. What am I willing to give up? And how do we get folks to come to that when some people are still trying to think that it has got nothing to do with them, that it's just the way the world is. And many of them sit in our churches on Sunday mornings. So we have to, that conversation needs to be in the center of our churches, and it's not, in ways that it's not. And that's what I keep preaching about everywhere I am, that because you're not going to change stuff until people are willing to let go of something.
Amen.
Not really. I mean, you can make people do a few things, but after a while, voting is a perfect example. I mean, we made people make it okay for us to vote. And now here we are in 2020, still talking about our votes. I mean, good
Yeah.
grief. You think, what? Did I go to sleep and miss something? Because why are we talking about voting? But because white folks aren't ready to give up their power. And so
Yeah.
we got to suppress people's right to vote.
Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, white people and white supremacy, you got to decide in a big general sense to let it go before
Right.
there's going to be, in this country, real liberation. And you know, that's not going to happen easily. We're going to have to disrupt a whole lot more stuff before we get there.
Agreed. And I think also this notion that, I mean, there's so much abundance in this country, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and the thing is that, you know, having more people sit at the table doesn't take anything away from anyone. It just means,
Right.
look, we're all still at the table. It just means
Right.
we're making room for more. And I think that where we're not looking is like the reason that so much of the abundance in this country is concentrated, right, in the hands of people who are billionaires and multi-billionaires and the hands of corporations and capital that are getting more bailout in this moment than individuals who are fighting for their lives to stay safe and stay home, or essential workers who are fighting for protection. So I think it really is also about shifting this notion of like that we're in competition for a scarce resource of humanity. And that we're in competition for scarce resources that are truly in abundance, but they're being hoarded and concentrated among certain people. And then I think, you know, I'm not in the church, so I'm inviting you all into something that, you know, from a different perspective, but get in the game, like get in the arena. Like, you know, police unions run this city in New York, and they run many cities, and churches are powerful, and churches have in the past, in not so healthy ways, run society. So get in the game, be a force to contend with, fight for the rights and values of all humans. And I think that's an important thing. I want to get to this other question too about, you know, I know that not everyone's here for abolition. It might be like for part of the conversation, and then people are going to get off the road at different points and say, well, I still think we need police for this or that. But I do think that the tools for building the society that we want are in our hands. We can do it, and we can start practicing it every day. So when someone said, what can our church do because there's more homeless people appearing in our immediate neighborhood? Of course, the immediate answer is to feed and house them, and to go down to City Hall and demand that they not have to sleep in a church basement and eat food that is provided as a charity. Get down, you know, fight for them as your parishioners. They're in your area, they're around your church, they're your parishioners. And so fight for your parishioners to make sure that they have what they need to not just be, I mean, sleeping on a church basement is slightly better than sleeping outside, but in COVID-19 times, it's actually maybe, you know, less safe.
Yeah.
So I think there's a piece that goes beyond kind of the charity or the support, the immediate emergency support, which is necessary, to getting into a game as a political force and saying, we as people of faith and people of belief are standing for our principles, and our principles are that nobody should sleep on the street. And our parishioners, our community are coming together to say, none of us are going to sleep on the street. And we will do for each other, but we expect the state to do for everybody.
That's right.
So I want to do what I'm not usually very good at, which is, you know, drawing things to a close.
He speaks the truth.
But I do want to be faithful and fair to our guests and to you both. I guess I don't know what we'll do about the remaining questions, except to know that, as I said before the event started, that we'll start with questions, and there'll be questions that will carry into the, you know, the time after our event ends. What it says to me is that we've done a really necessary thing that we need to keep doing, and whether it's St. Anne and the Holy Trinity, the deanery that this church is a part of, or other parishes and communities in this diocese and around the church, we've got to step up. You both have indicated, I think, that you actually trust people to do the work, and that's a really powerful thing. I'm going to leave this discussion with, and kind of take into my own ministry and my relationships with my community, It's that you actually believe we're capable of affecting the change that you've described as really kind of incredible and hard to wrap your arms around in a certain way, but that you trust the church, you trust uh, uh, members of our neighborhoods and cities to sort of enact and to believe enough in to make happen. So I didn't really want to have like the last word. I did want to be sure to say from the bottom of my heart how incredibly grateful I am to you both. I guess I'm not really surprised, but you know, until you started talking to one another, this was your first opportunity, I just couldn't be sure. And then it just instantly became clear that you two have a lot to say to each other, and have, you know, a lot invested in what each other is doing. So thank you for a really, really rich conversation. Marie, I don't know what you want to say in conclusion. I know that you may draw us to a close in some prayerful way, and I want to ask you to do that.
Sure, I will definitely pray us out, and also want to really thank our guests. Such an incredible conversation between them, but also with us. And I know that through the comments, there have been a lot of grateful comments for people really enjoyed this, and I'm just so I'm much more hopeful after this conversation than I expected to be, which is a rare thing these days. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right.
Thank you so much for having us, and I'm so grateful.
Yeah, I loved getting to talk to you, Andrea. When you come to Atlanta again, please let me know.
Definitely. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay, go ahead.
No worries.
Interrupt God. No.
Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you for the blessing of this day and the blessings brought to us by these two loving humans, Andrea and Catherine, serving in your vineyard. We pray that all could feel safe, especially those in our world who are at the intersection of so much societal violence. We pray for recovery from our addiction to violence and punishment, and that we can reactivate our God-given imaginations to address these illnesses. Help us to see the image of God in one another. Help us to listen deeply and to have the courage to change our old habits of violence and fear. And we ask for this strength and guidance from you, our loving Creator, who has given us life and the capacity to love and to reimagine the kingdom of God here on earth. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you, Dr. Meeks.
Yeah,
Thank you, Andrea.
you're so welcome.
Thank
That's
you
great.
all. God bless you.